Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. From the mid-'80s well on into the 21st century, the Beach Boys, both collectively and individually, have contributed tracks to a lot of special projects, things like movie soundtracks, tribute albums, things along those lines. Now there's more of those than we can talk about in one episode, even several episodes, but today I'd like to make a start. Now it seems like a logical place to start might be way back in 1979 with the track It's a Beautiful Day from the Americathon soundtrack album. But I've already talked pretty extensively about this way back in episode 5, the Beach Boys 1979 Part 2. So I'd like to begin in 1984 with their next exclusive soundtrack release, Chasing the Sky, from the soundtrack of the movie Up the Creek. By 1984 it had become pretty standard for movies aimed at teens and young adults to feature rock bands in their soundtracks. So I was always on the lookout for new soundtrack releases and would check the track listing to see if it included anybody that I was interested in. And in the corner of the Up the Creek soundtrack it says featuring Cheap Trick, The Beach Boys, Heart, Shooting Star, Randy Bishop, Ian Hunter, Danny Spanos, and Kick-Axe. Turning the album over, I was pleased to see that rather than just being a track from an earlier Beach Boys record that was reused in the soundtrack, this was actually a new Beach Boys recording called Chasing the Sky. It was the first new Beach Boy release since 1980 with Keeping the Summer Alive, so it had been about 4 years. Of course, during that time, Dennis had passed away at the end of 1983. So this was kind of an interesting development to hear a new Beach Boy track and the first since the loss of Dennis. In fact, in the picture of the Beach Boys on the back here, this promo photo, you really can see where Dennis probably would have stood, and I think they sort of left a space there for Dennis in this photo. I think it's actually deliberate, but always really miss Dennis when I see that particular photo. As for the track Chasing the Sky, it's very different from anything that came before and since. Part of the reason is it's not really a Beach Boys song. It was written by songwriter Randy Bishop. Randy Bishop wrote or co-wrote half the tracks on this album, and all the tracks were produced by producer Spencer Proffer at his Pasha Records recording studio, and the album is on the Pasha Records label. Now, Spencer Proffer's production credits had gone back to the very early 70s. He'd done a lot of work. Recently, he had formed the Pasha Records label and had had great success with Quiet Riot and their hit Come On Feel the Noise from the Mental Health album. The Pasha label also sported the Canadian heavy metal band Kick-Axe, who appear on this soundtrack album as well. So this was a kind of an unusual soundtrack album in that it's really a Spencer Proffer, Randy Bishop project with artists such as the Beach Boys largely guest starring. I'm not sure how the Beach Boys came to be part of this project, but I suspect the connection is Bruce Johnston. In the early 1980s, Bruce had formed his own label, Johnston Records, and one of his signings was former Herman's Hermit, Peter Noone. A year prior, 1983, Peter Noone had released his album, One of the Glory Boys, on the Johnston record label. That album was produced by Spencer Proffer, and 5 of the album's 9 tracks were written or co-written by Randy Bishop. So there's all our principles all connected together. Whether that's just circumstantial or not, I don't know, but I suspect it was Bruce that got the Beach Boys involved in the project. It was a very low-key release. If you hadn't been like me, who was going through new release record bins constantly, even a Beach Boy fan probably would have missed it. There was nothing heralding like, the Beach Boys are back after a long hiatus or anything like that. Very low-key release. And I'm sure it being featured in the film Up the Creek really didn't give it much promotion either. I've never watched this movie in full, but you can kind of tell from the cover what it is. Also, you can tell by the fact that it stars Tim Matheson and Stephen Furst from Animal House, Dan Monahan from Porky's, that this is a comedy very much in the Animal House vein. Furst and Matheson had seemed way too old to be college students back in 1978 in Animal House. By the time of Up the Creek, it's getting kind of ridiculous looking. At the time they filmed this, Tim Matheson was 36 years old. They try to explain it away by saying that he's such a slacker that he's been in college for 12 years, but actually that's coming across at this point rather pathetic instead of funny. The plot, such as it is, revolves around some college student slackers who somehow get involved in a raft race against some other colleges, including a military academy and an Ivy League prep school with a bunch of snobby rich kids. You kind of get the idea where this thing is going. So how is the song Chasing the Sky? As I mentioned before, it's really unlike anything the Beach Boys did before or after, largely because they're sort of guest starring on somebody else's track. The backing track is sort of a muted heavy metal thing, which is not surprising given Spencer Proffer's background with Quiet Riot and Kick-Axe. Nice vocal from Carl, although I'm beginning to realize it's redundant to say Carl Wilson's vocal is beautiful, because I don't think Carl Wilson ever did anything less than a beautiful vocal. Muted backing vocals. The song itself kind of might be something you're listening through maybe the first chorus. There's no real hook in the first chorus, so can't really tell where this thing is going. Until, for me, when it gets to the second line of the chorus, where they sing, "Waiting for my ship to come in." And at that point, the song reveals itself to be something like a theme song from an 80s sitcom. It takes a real turn there. I'm not enough of a musicologist to tell you what it is in the melody there that makes it turn that way. But at that point, you get the feeling that this is a really lightweight sitcom theme style song with a heavy metal backing and the Beach Boys trapped somewhere in the middle. It was such a low-key release, I have the feeling that the Beach Boys weren't particularly enamored of it themselves. The next Beach Boy release I'd like to talk about, also from 1984, was so obscure and so low-key that even I didn't realize it existed until the summer of 1985. The name of the song is East Meets West, and it's credited to the Beach Boys and Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. It's largely the Beach Boys guesting on a Four Seasons record. It's on the Four Seasons FBI label. The writers are Bob Gaudio and Bob Carew, the regular Four Seasons songwriters. In the 60s, there had been some minor hype about the Beach Boys being the West Coast vocal group and the Four Seasons being the East Coast vocal group, and how there was some sort of rivalry. It obviously was nothing like the rivalry between Biggie and Tupac years later, but there was supposed to be this rivalry. And near the end of the song Surfer's Rule on the Surfer Girl album, the Beach Boys, of course, include the refrain, "Four Seasons, you better believe it," along with a Walk Like a Man style falsetto vocal. And the Four Seasons, on the B-side of their hit Dawn in 1964, included the track No Surfin' Today, in which the singer's love, who they refer to as the Surfer Girl, is drowned by being dragged down below, way beyond the reef, where they said not to go. Apparently, the tragic drowning of his girlfriend is enough to stop the protagonist from surfing for 24 hours. It's the kind of teen tragedy surfing hybrid that you don't get again until the Barracudas' obscure Drop Out with the Barracudas album in 1981 with the song His Last Summer. If you've never heard this album, Drop Out with the Barracudas. Side 1 is not really to my taste. It's more Velvet Underground influenced and not really all that memorable. But side 2 is a bunch of original songs, all loving homages to the mid-60s and particularly to the Beach Boys sound. And they sound roughly as if they're being performed by The Clash, which is a really cool effect. Really love side 2 of Drop Out with the Barracudas. If you ever get a chance, you should give it a listen. Anyway, back to the record at hand and back to 1984 with East Meets West by the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons. The song itself is really not much count, sadly. It's a very 80s production, very dated. The tune sounds as if it's trying to be upbeat and energetic and constantly failing to produce the sort of energy that it's going for. The main thing that's interesting about the song is spotting the vocals, and of course I'm better at spotting Beach Boy vocals than I am Four Season vocals, but I can hear Frankie Valli take a lead line in there. Carl, Mike, and Al each get a lead line. Toward the end, Brian gets a couple of lead lines to himself. You can hear that they're all there. The song's not all that interesting. Lyrically, they just talk about the great aspects of the East Coast and the great aspects of the West Coast and how when they two meet, the best survive. So not really an inspiring tune, sort of an excuse to get the two groups together and hear their vocals together. As a personal note, I found this 45 at Tower Records on Sunset in the summer of 1985, shortly after I moved to Los Angeles. I bought it, threw it in my trunk, basically forgot about it. I had no fixed address for the first several months I was in LA in 1985. It laid at the bottom of my trunk with a bunch of other junk out in the heat. I was sure the thing had melted to a blob and that I would never ever get to hear it and I'd have to go buy another copy. Amazingly, when I pulled it out and played it, it was just fine. No damage whatsoever. So whatever FBI Records is doing, they press a nice record. So let's move ahead now to March of 1987 and a much more auspicious release in the Beach Boys' careers. That being the first proper Brian Wilson solo single, Let's Go to Heaven in My Car, from the Police Academy 4 Citizens on Patrol soundtrack. Now, I don't remember where I first heard about this single, but I do know that I knew it was coming and I was on the lookout for it. And I remember very clearly going to Renee's Records on Melrose in LA, buying the single and walking down the street and really kind of being amazed that not only was Brian Wilson alive in 1987, he had actually managed to put out a solo single. I remember I knew the title of the song, Let's Go to Heaven in My Car, which sounded pretty cool, car songs being really hip in the mid-80s, after being sort of not sung about by anybody but Bruce Springsteen occasionally in the 70s. 80s with New Wave, songs about cars were really cool with everybody from Gary Newman to Tracy Chapman. So it sounded like a really cool title and I was really looking forward to this. I was a little less excited about the fact it was from the soundtrack to Police Academy 4 Citizens on Patrol. In the film, it plays in the background during a scene where David Spade, in his feature film debut, skateboards through a mall, and it's also heard briefly in the opening credits. As a footnote, as critically reviled as Police Academy movies were, there was only one time when a Police Academy movie received a nomination for a Golden Raspberry or Razzie Award, and that was Police Academy 4 for Worst Original Song, Let's Go to Heaven in My Car by Brian Wilson. The song lost to I Want Your Sex by George Michael from Beverly Hills Cop 2. Not sure why that took the award. Of course, that year belonged to Bill Cosby and his film Leonard Part 6, despite heavy competition from the film Ishtar, from Madonna and Who's That Girl, and from Jaws: The Revenge. Did Let's Go to Heaven in My Car deserve a Golden Raspberry nomination? That's debatable. The song came from the sessions that Dr. Landy had arranged between Brian and his old collaborator Gary Usher in the mid-80s. Writing is credited to Brian Wilson, Eugene E. Landy, and Gary Usher. So this is very much out of the Landy period that Gary Usher wrote about in his journals, which were published as the Wilson Project, and we'll talk more about this in depth at some point in the future. The production credit tells quite a tale. It's produced by Brian Wilson, executive producer Dr. Eugene E. Landy, and co-produced by Gary Usher. Something that the book makes plain in Usher's notes is his extreme frustration with Landy wanting to tinker with Let's Go to Heaven in My Car almost up to the moment that it was released. And even if you don't know the backstory on this, it's one of the things that really jumps out at you when you listen to it. It's a fairly simple tune, got some interesting tempo changes, but production-wise, there's just too much going on. It's a really big production for such a simple tune, and it's really more than it needs. There's a harp sample over one of the tempo changes. There's some oohs or woos in the background at a certain point that just kind of come out of nowhere. Is simply too much in this is part of the problem with it. It's not a great song anyway, but the production is huge, but that doesn't really help. The B-side, Too Much Sugar, has the writing credit Brian Wilson, Eugene E. Landy, and Alexandra Morgan, who was Landy's girlfriend. The production credit on that side of the record is Brian Wilson, executive producer, Dr. Eugene E. Landy. Of course, you expect less from a B-side, and that's certainly what Too Much Sugar delivers. Musically, it harkens back to one of Brian's musical obsessions, which is the tune Shortening Bread. Too Much Sugar is very much just another rewrite of Shortening Bread, which throwaway Brian Wilson tracks often become. Lyrically, it returns to his occasional interest in singing about physical fitness. There are things like HELP is on the way, an unreleased track from the early 70s. Often he sings about it with charm and with a simplicity that only Brian Wilson can do. Here, I think you really see the lyrical hand of Gene Landy at work, as the lyrics are not so much charming as inane. Things like getting in shape is what it's all about, move all around just like Jane Fonda now. Of course, Jane Fonda was most famous in the mid-80s for her 1981 best-selling workout book, her workout video, one of the very first successful home video releases, and her number 15 hit workout album from 1981, in which contemporary pop tracks were overdubbed with Jane Fonda's voice encouraging you to exercise. I have to admit I was a little disappointed in Brian Wilson's first solo single, but there was much better to come in the next year when Brian released his first solo album. Incidentally, does anybody know why these mid-80s singles, particularly Sire, get this stuff on the label that's sort of like salt crystals? It formed very early, within a year or so of buying the singles. It's on several different labels. Sire seems to be one of the main culprits. Don't know what that stuff is. It doesn't seem to hurt anything, but it's kind of annoying. Just wonder if anybody knows what that is. Thanks for watching. Obviously, there's a lot more to get to. I'm not even moving as fast as I expected to because each one of these tracks is so unique and so one of a kind that I think they deserve a little extra exploration. Please let me know if you can shed any light on any of these items, particularly how the Chase in the Sky thing came about. I'd really like to know more about that. If I missed anything, please let me know. Of course, there are a lot of tracks I know I haven't talked about yet, too. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time. Bye.